Last time I was talking about how Middlemarch is kind of about that saying that life is what happens while you're making other plans. Um, characters seem um, characters' destinies are dictated by accidents, things that happened in spite of their intentions. The last thing that seems to matter um, are characters' own intentions for themselves. um, Again, that theme of the web, um, this interplay of accident um, is the real determining factor in life, rather than what we might intend, um, our explicit conscious ideas of what's going on. Um, so I want to explore that a little bit more this time, especially in connection with maybe the idea of chaos theory. Eliot begins chapter 27 famously with a little parable that you could say is about chaos. If you look at your pier glass or extensive surface of polished steel, it'll be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions. But place now against it a lighted candle as a center of illumination, and lo, the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles around that little sun. It's demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it's only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of concentric arrangement, its light falling with an exclusive optical selection. So, this is a parable. Scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent. For instance, Miss Vinci. Two things to say about that. One is the parable in its own right is really powerful. The scratches go everywhere impartially. The world is fundamentally chaotic. We organize it around our little sun, our set of personal interests. On the one hand, it seems like the parable is at Rosie's expense. But on the other hand, I'm not sure what it would mean to be able to bear witness to the impartiality, the chaos itself. This is kind of a little personal aside. I've kind of been prone to depression all my life, or since university. And when I sort of first started realizing it, it was reading somewhere about depression. I read that depressed people tend to have a more accurate perception of reality than non-depressed people do, a more accurate sense of, probabilities of, things working out. And I remember being kind of devastated by that, because it's like, in a way, it's sort of saying you're right to be depressed, and you're responding appropriately to reality. But it's actually led me to kind of the opposite point of view, that life isn't about being correct. Life is, about pursuing dreams, sharing dreams with other people. Objectively correct perception and appropriate logical reasoning are not things to live for, right? Nothing lasts in a certain way. It's to be invested in the transitory things of life is irrational on some level. That's what gives life value, not being correct. It also makes me read this parable a little different than I might have in the past. I think, what would it mean to bear witness to this, the chaos of the scratches going in every direction? That's a kind of a scary prospect of a, a totally impersonal, indifferent universe. Maybe Eliot's suggesting a little bit of the limits of her critique of egoism. After all, Rosamund's shown to have a capacity to shape events according to her idea. Unlike Lydgate, she's not just floating around blindly. Her idea has a shaping activity, capacity to shape how things play out. The idea organizes her eyes, her watchful blue eyes, which have an effect on the world around them. Eliot describes the shaping activity of Rosamund's eyes, shaping the moment that Lydgate falls in love with her. She describes it as spontaneous and ingenuous. That moment of naturalness was the crystallizing feather touch. It shook flirtation into love. That crystallizing reminds me of the secret ministry of frost, the crystal formation. She's not intending or willing, but she's mobilizing accidents according to her idea. She is, if not willing a certain outcome, she's prepared for that feather touch, that crystallizing feather touch when it comes. This idea about the independence of our behavior from strict causal determination is even espoused by neuroscientists, the kind of people that are all about studying the causal determinations of behavior in the brain. So here we have Robert Sapolsky, amazing TED Talk. First, he's talking about the neural factors of evolution affecting our behavior. But then he goes through to give a number of examples of people radically changing their behavior against the grain, as I've been sort of suggesting, of the causal conditions around them. So he ends up proposing a reversal of the commonplace that if you don't study history, you're bound to repeat it. He says what you should study is the capacity to radically ignore history, to go against the grain of history. So the lesson he takes is those that don't study these examples of radical change coming out of nowhere are bound not to be able to repeat them. They're bound to be stuck having their behavior conditioned by causal determination around them.
But we've got to push even further back millions of years, because if we're talking about genes, implicitly, we're now talking about the evolution of genes. And what you see is, for example, patterns across different primate species. Some of them have evolved for extremely low levels of aggression. Others have evolved in the opposite direction. And floating there in between by every measure are humans. Once again, this confused, barely defined species that has all these potentials to go one way or the other. So what has this gotten us to? Basically, what we're seeing here is if you want to understand a behavior, whether it's an appalling one, a wondrous one, or confusedly in between, if you want to understand that, you've got to take into account what happened a second before to a million years before, everything in between. So what can we conclude at this point? Officially, it's complicated. Wow, that's really helpful. It's complicated, and you better be real careful, real cautious before you conclude you know what causes a behavior, especially if it's a behavior you're judging harshly. Now, to me, the single most important point about all of this is one having to do with change. Every bit of biology I have mentioned here can change in different circumstances. For example, ecosystems change. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was a lush grassland. Cultures change. In the 17th century, the most terrifying people in Europe were the Swedes, rampaging all over the place. This is what the Swedish military does now. They haven't had a war in 200 years. Most importantly, brains change. Neurons grow new processes, circuits disconnect, everything in the brain changes, and out of this come extraordinary examples of human change. First one. This is a man named John Newton, a British theologian who played a central role in the abolition of slavery from the British Empire in the early 1800s. And amazingly, this man spent decades as a younger man as the captain of a slave ship, and then as an investor in slavery, growing rich from this. And then something changed. Something changed in him, something that Newton himself celebrated in the thing that he's most famous for, a hymn that he wrote, Amazing Grace. This is a man named Zenji Abe on the morning of December 6, 1941, about to lead a squadron of Japanese bombers to attack Pearl Harbor. And this is the same man 50 years later to the day hugging a man who survived the attack on the ground. And as an old man, Zenji Abe came to a collection of Pearl Harbor survivors at a ceremony there, and in halting English, apologized for what he had done as a young man. Now, it doesn't always require decades. Sometimes extraordinary change could happen in just hours. Consider the World War I Christmas truce of 1914. Powers that be had negotiated a brief truce so that soldiers could go out, collect bodies from no man's land in between the trench lines. And soon, British and German soldiers were doing that, and then helping each other carry bodies, and then helping each other dig graves in the frozen ground, and then praying together, and then having Christmas together and exchanging gifts. And by the next day, they were playing soccer together and exchanging addresses so they could meet after the war. That truce kept going until the officers had to arrive and said, "We will shoot you unless you go back to trying to kill each other." And all it took here was hours for these men to develop a completely new category of us, all of us in the trenches here on both sides, dying for no damn reason. And who was a them? Those faceless powers behind the lines who were using them as pawns. And sometimes change can occur in seconds. Probably the most horrifying event in the Vietnam War was the My Lai massacre. A brigade of American soldiers went into an undefended village full of civilians and killed between 350 and 500 of them. Mass raped women and children, mutilated bodies. It was appalling. It was appalling because it occurred, because the government denied it, because the US government eventually did nothing more than a slap on the wrist, and appalling because it almost certainly was not a singular event. This man, Hugh Thompson, this is the man who stopped the My Lai massacre. He was piloting a helicopter gunship, landed there, got out, and saw American soldiers shooting babies, shooting old women, figured out what was going on, and he then took his helicopter and did something that undid his lifetime of conditioning as to who is an us and who is a them. He landed his helicopter in between some surviving villagers and American soldiers, and he trained his machine guns on his fellow Americans and said, "If you don't stop the killing, I will mow you down." Now, these people are no more special than any of us. Same neurons, same neurochemicals, same biology. What we're left with here is this inevitable cliche: those who don't study history are destined to repeat it. What we have here is the opposite of it. Those who don't study the history of extraordinary human change, those who don't study the biology of what can transform us from our worst to our best behaviors, those who don't do this are destined not to be able to repeat these incandescent, magnificent moments. So thank you.
So I think that parable about the scratched mirror is maybe not as simple as it seems at first, especially coming at the expense of Rosie, because I think that Rosie is shown to mobilize her egoism in a way that comes off favorably compared to Lydgate's passivity. That shaping activity, I think that's what we're supposed to do. I think our ideas are supposed to have shaping activity. Indeed, in relationships or in personal psychology, our conscious intentions are often alibis, part of a strategy of evasion or denial, or rationalization for us to do something else. Like Lydgate's lingering with Rosamund, flirting at the piano, calling himself her captive, meaning all the while not to be her captive. So Lydgate's totally playing a game with himself of false consciousness, making himself exactly what he's telling himself he's not. It's another example where I wonder if Eliot is kind of mocking herself, mocking the philosopher who told her this parable, and maybe mocking the reader for feeling holier than thou. I mean, the point she makes there is the candle is the egoism of anyone now absent. That's I'm not so egotistical myself, but this I see how that parable applies to other people. I wonder if on some level she's kind of turning the tables on that complacency with regard to Rosie. I mean, because that's Lydgate's attitude, right? He thinks he's so much smarter, and so that complacency is what makes him so vulnerable to being shaped by her egoism. Eliot's, I think, maybe wanting to keep us honest a little bit, like, um, a philosopher that's kind of like Casaubon, that stands above the world, is kind of scared of actually intervening in the world in a personal way. He stands aloof, manipulates the world from a distance. Maybe the narrator there is being a little too clever by half, and uh, in passing judgment on from a distance, from this ivory tower philosopher's perspective, um, on characters that are having to live in the real world, and that maybe that egotism comes with the territory to some degree. There are some other examples, though, of a kind of shaping activity, or what I was calling last time aesthetic experience, that seems to go against the grain of the narrative. Um, for example, here in the story of Fred's ignoble groveling to the Garce, Eliot casts it as an example of that idea of Feuerbach's, that other people are my conscience. My conscience is in other people. It says that Mary is serving that role for Fred here, and she describes it in a way that makes it sound almost heroic, which is pretty amazing because Fred is such a slacker. It's not that he knows he's not making her proud. He's kind of disgusting her, and she says as much. But his love for her here is making him do better than he would otherwise. And so that even in his, lowest moment ever, as explicitly said, Eliot, in a funny way, is kind of casting it as heroic. She even compares it to ancient classical drama. The theater of my actions is fallen, said an antique personage when his chief friend was dead. And they are fortunate who get a theater where the audience demands their best. Certainly it would have made a considerable difference to Fred at that time if Mary Garth had had no decided notions as to what was admirable in character. So that's quite moving. I mean, he's trying to do justice to Mary's ideas of trying to live up to her ideas of what an admirable character is. Even while he's, according to the narrative, sort of the most ashamed as he's ever been. And I think Dorothea discovers similarly kind of shaping activity by way of this miniature of Casaubon's Aunt Julia, Will Ladislaw's grandmother. So, this is in the wake of the honeymoon from hell, and she's still trying to be the good servant of her husband, but her world is really collapsed. It's totally disenchanted, deadened. It's really bleak. She's so depressed. But this, seeing this miniature really does something for her. It, again, provides a shaping form for her struggles with marriage. She's finding a resonant echo, an image, simple image that she can project her feelings onto and feel some, what she, specifically calls a companionship, a friendship with this little miniature. It's especially powerful, I thought, in connection with the words she says to Celia, or what she doesn't say to Celia, her until now closest confidant. Sally asks her if it's nice, do you think it's nice to go to Rome for a wedding journey? And Dorothea sort of demurs and says, it's not for everybody, but then thinks to herself, no one would ever know what she thought of a wedding journey to Rome. Again, that sort of heavy despair and keeping it to herself. And yet here she feels a sense of companionship. I think a sense of this miniature. It's such a meager thing, but it provides her again that shaping activity. I think that's what's going on here. She looks at this. Gosh, it's just, there's so much emotion in this narration. The salt tears, the breadths of experience they're crystallizing. I think that word crystallizing is really apt. It reminds me of this little clip of Mr. Rogers talking about music and emotion, how transitions in music can provide a image, a helpful guide for negotiating one's own emotional transitions.
Come on over a minute. I just had some ideas that I'd been thinking about for quite a while about modulation. It seems to me that there are different themes in life. And one of my main jobs, it seems to me, is to help through the mass media for children, to help children through some of the difficult modulations of life. Because it's easy, for instance, to go from C to F. But there are some modulations that aren't so easy. For instance, to go from F to F sharp, you've got to weave through all sorts of things. And it seems to me, if you've got somebody to help you as you weave, maybe this is just too philosophical. Maybe I'm trying to combine things that can't be combined, but it makes sense to me.
Processing of emotion, working through rather than being kind of oppressed by the diffuse, confusing weight of emotion. It's liberating to feel it communicated or echoed in the way that Dorothea describes here. Was it only her friends who thought her marriage unfortunate, or did she herself find it out to be a mistake and taste the salt bitterness of her tears in the merciful silence of the night? What breadths of experience Dorothea seemed to have passed over since she first looked at this miniature. She felt a new companionship with it, as if it had an ear for her and could see how she was looking at it. Here was a woman who had known some difficulty about marriage. Nay, the colors deepened. The lips and chin seemed to get larger. The hair and eyes seemed to be sending out light. The face was masculine and beamed on her with that full gaze which tells her on whom it falls that she is too interesting for the slightest movement of her eyelid to pass unnoticed and uninterpreted. The vivid presentation came like a pleasant glow to Dorothea. She felt herself smiling, and turning from the miniature sat down and looked up as if she were again talking to a figure in front of her. It's really something. Much like, I'd suggest, some to think about, our relationship with her. She's imaginary. We're having an imaginary relationship with her. Projecting, like we do. I think that's part of what reading fiction is about, projecting our emotions onto characters we relate to, imagining they know the taste of salt bitterness that we've experienced. Just to underscore that analogy with reading, with what we're doing, the narrator describes Caleb similarly to how Dorothea falls in love with that miniature. The narrator lavishes, adoration on Caleb. And what's especially striking here is that this, again, is kind of a low point in his character. This is when he's making a huge mistake signing this loan for Fred. But this is precisely the scene where she can't help gushing over how much she loves his little mannerisms, the personal expression, his body, his movements are what make him lovable, rather than the action itself that he's doing. He's performing probably, stupidest action that he does it all in the narrative, but he embodies this shape or aesthetic vision of the narrators that she cherishes. And again, if it, mentioned that Caleb is sort of a surrogate for her father. So rather than trying to give us linear causal accounts of her various characters' stories, Eliot is, as she puts it, trying to shine light on this weaving and interweaving of circumstances. That's to say, instead of a causal explanation of life, we're getting sort of pattern recognition. That's what Middlemarch is instructing us in. But that's sort of what Middlemarch means in a way, marching through the middle, marching through these patterns. It's also what the Romantic poets I gave you to look at over the break, as well as Darwin, explore. Things play out unpredictably, but at scale we can recognize these patterns. Again, that idea of the fact of frequency. We can recognize patterns that also conform to a kind of emotional intelligence. Mood, atmosphere, register these environmental patterns. Iconic example of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. We're given no explanation why the mariner shot the albatross or why the albatross falls from his neck. So causal explanation is unavailable. Instead, what we get is a sense of mood, of emotion, surprising attentiveness to details in the environment, the snakes reflected in the moonlight, sparkling white like hoarfrost, or deep red and green within the shadow of the ship where the mariner can see under the water. Noticing these details that don't serve any narrative explanation, but they flesh out subjective experiences, a kind of mood that's interactive between the self and the environment. So I like the word mood because it suggests both a psychological state in the subject and an atmospheric state in the surroundings. And these patterns here, Darwin's Tree of Life is describing species variation over time. They branch off with different variants, and those branches sprout different variants. This pattern is called arborization, because it looks like a tree. It looks like tree branches. And this form is found throughout nature. It's, virtually universal. It's could be a riverbed, could be the veins in your arm, it could be the, neural networks in your brain. This is a form of environmental interaction. Testing, experimenting, testing what works, sticking with what works, but then continuously updating as we move along. It's an expression as much of the environment, success in the environment, as of the organism itself.